Hi everyone, and welcome back to episode 3 of Playing the System. Today I'm delighted to be joined by a very old friend of mine, Paul Naturaj, who I have not spoken to or seen for 20 years. What is astonishing about this is we met at the University of Westminster 20 years ago and we're friends. And then we've both gone off on our own life journeys and not spoken for 20 years and ended up in very similar places. Paul is a sound artist. He's a deep cultural and critical thinker. I have his wonderful album here called Cobblestones and Kitchari. Paul has a PhD that he, I think, titled "You Sound Like a Broken Record." I'm laughing because I'm sure many people may say that about me. And Paul has just started an incredible podcast called Kick Down the Barriers. So in this episode, we talk about creativity and the creative act against a very different political climate since 2016. We talk about unleashing the creativity of limitation, and we talk a lot, or Paul talks a lot, about the inspirations behind his record, Music Concrete, and I've written them down in my trusty field notes notebook. Nilan Mizak, Christian Malaki, and William Burroughs and his cut and paste techniques. I'm going to ask Paul as well to make a playlist that accompanies this episode so we can check out some of these inspirations for ourselves. And throughout the episode, Paul has also allowed us to use his music wherever we feel appropriate. So there's going to be Paul's music all throughout the episode. So I hope you enjoy it. I love talking to Paul, and fundamentally I would say that Paul is a really positive and lovely man. So thanks for coming back for episode 3. Delighted to have you on board, and enjoy the ride. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Welcome to Play in the System, episode 3. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Paul Naturaj, who is, firstly, a long-term friend who I haven't seen until now for 20 years. And this is absolutely incredible. But most importantly, Paul is here because he's a sound artist, he's a deep thinker, he's a cultural resonator, and a brilliant person to speak to. So we caught up yesterday before this to have a kind of preamble that obviously lasted 2 hours. It was amazing. I kind of wish I'd recorded it, but I've every confidence we're going to do the same today. So welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It means so much to me. And I found this just before this last minute interview I read. And I don't know why I was reading this because I wasn't supposed to be. And I thought I'd read it out because it resonates so much with our stories. Now, the question is, where in my phone did I see it, and can I find it? It was an Orteca interview, and I might have to cut a little bit out of this while I find it because it is really worth reading out.
No worries.
Here we go. I found it. So yeah, this is in the New York Times today, and this is what it said. Physicists have verified a phenomenon called quantum entanglement, in which particles separated by great distances somehow exhibit perfectly matching behaviour. Isn't that amazing, right? Because what we identified yesterday was, despite not having seen each other or spoken for 20 years, we got married within a week of each other in 2013, and we've ended up doing very, very similar things. So I love that quote, and I thought, that really sums it up. So yeah, welcome to the show. Thank you for agreeing to do it. Now, we kind of jumped straight off, didn't we, even before we pressed record, and we were talking about your very snazzy microphone and your very unsnazzy pop shield, and the fact that that is probably the only professional piece of audio you own. And we were talking about the creative limitations that come from that. So how do you find creativity in these limitations?
So the microphone is a beautiful thing, right? And I acquired it, and actually everything that I've got, I've acquired. I don't think I've actually bought any piece of equipment.
Sounds like you've nicked it, Paul.
That's like a really nice way of putting it. But I do. I kind of just accumulate stuff, and then I make the most out of it, or I try at least to make the most out of it. And I think that's it. It absolutely 100%. Changes the way in which I work, but it also is definitely part of the sounds that I create, because the majority of stuff that I've ever done, I've worked from samples. So I'm not a player. Like, I'll put that out there straight away. I'm not a player. So I work from samples, and in the main, everything that I've tried to do up until this point has been from samples that people have given me or that I've acquired. So that's another little constraint. I try not to be a person who chooses something, because I think he goes out there and goes, you know what, I really love this, so I'm going to use it. I find it from people, and then I try and manipulate it into something that I think sounds good. So that's definitely part of the creative process for me. And in a way, working in the box for a long time in terms of kind of either on Logic. I've done quite a lot of stuff actually on Adobe Audition, simply because I come from a radio background, and that was kind of a really simple editing program that we always used to work with. And then I kind of thought, you know what, I can do something with this which is a little bit outside of just chopping voices up or doing the radio stuff. And what I kind of found from that, and I'm sure a lot of sound people will kind of agree with this, is that if you're working in the box, there's a limitation on the way something sounds, and actually the air of a room, getting stuff out of the box and onto a material is really important, I think. So with the last record that I did, the Cobblestones and Kitchari record, or tape, that very one, yeah. So basically, a lot of the stuff on there is recorded back out onto tape, just very simple cassette tapes, and then played through this another thing that I acquired actually, which I found in a cupboard at college, which was a 1970s Kuma tape player that they probably used to record like assemblies or whatever, and I just played everything through tapes back out into this microphone, just to give everything some air. But essentially I'm always working within the computer first of all, and then trying to send stuff back out to try and get a bit of roughness. And I think that's the other thing about not having a lot of equipment. I don't have racks of stuff. I don't have lots of processing, so I'm happy with roughness. I like roughness. I like roughness, and I like dynamics, and I like the fact that everything's not mastered to its, to its breaking point, or everything's really fat. This fatness thing or this loudness thing. I kind of like the fact that things can be quiet, and that's all right, or don't really pump. And that's okay. So I like that kind of the feeling of the material, but the feeling of the roughness and things just not being as they should be. Let's put it that way. Do you know what I mean? So, nothing's mastered as such.
Yeah.
I think when I sent the stuff to Graham, who put the record out on Fractal Meat, Graham Dunning, he said, shall I just do a little master on it? I said, look, man, you can do what you want to it. It's absolutely fine. And, I'm kind of not precious about that stuff particularly as well, because I think you can overthink that. And I also think it sometimes can stop you from finishing something. I think there's a process of abandonment when you kind of go, right, what am I actually trying to say with this thing?
Yeah.
And have I said it? And if I've said it, do I really need to niggle with it even more to make it say something else, and emotionally? And a lot of the time I don't think you do. But, perhaps people might turn around and say, oh, well, that's you being lazy. I don't know.
Well, it's a brilliant record, and it's a record I keep coming back to. I've, like many people, kind of turned my back on Spotify. And I still have a Spotify subscription, but I've really, like a lot of creatives, gravitated towards Bandcamp as a much fairer system for us makers. But most importantly, rather than fairness, what I believe it offers is a belonging, a community. I like belonging on Bandcamp. I feel part of it. I don't feel part of Spotify. It's like I have been fortunate that some of my productions have had New Music Friday, and that does feel great. But there's something about Bandcamp and the community there, and that's where I found you'd made a record. I didn't know you made records. I knew you as a DJ, and I knew you were into hip-hop 20 years ago, and God knows what you knew me as 20 years ago. But we weren't particularly in the same space. And then when I found you made this record, I listened to it and fell in love with it. And this morning I was listening to the track. Which one was I listening to? Yeah, because the track names are fairly abstract, aren't they?
Yeah, they can be, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was You Know Him So Well.
Oh, yeah,
Is that really droney?
Yeah.
Yeah, cosmic sounding track. It's a fascinating record, and I'm interested by the intention. What was the intention of the maker? What were you intending the listener? This is what I thought. It sounds like a very personal record, but a very abstracted record, and a lot of what Mark Fisher calls hauntology, which I'm sure you've come across.
Yeah.
It put me in a very interesting place, and I was wondering when I was listening to it, what was your intention for the listener?
That's really wow, what a question, man. What a question.
Yeah.
I don't know if I kind of have that thought process before I start doing something. And I think that comes from the fact that I've never really made anything that's been particularly commercially viable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So actually, I'm not considering that when I start to make something. I'm considering what really, I know this might sound, again, selfish or whatever, but I'm considering what I want to do. And I'm considering what sounds good to me in terms of, let's take that track, for example, You Know Him So Well. So that track, the whole album's about my dad, right? So my dad passed away in 2013, and from that point, I was making bits and pieces of stuff. What I kind of realised was that everything that I was doing was in some way related to him. So all the sounds that I was using, the samples that I was using, the things that I was finding were all somehow related to him. And so that just became like the go-to for everything that I made. So You Know Him So Well is by Barbara Dickinson and Elaine Page, right? And he loved it, right?
Yeah.
And he also loves Simply Red. So there's a load of Simply Red stuff on there as well. Now, and this is kind of the point of what I try and do, which is I would never in a million years, right?
I mean, Simply Red could not be further from my mind when I think of you.
Well, exactly. And that's exactly it, right?
But so my mum was a massive...
I would never choose to sample a Simply Red song, ever.
Yeah.
And that record's got two. right?
That's amazing.
I would never ever think to sample Elaine Page, right? It just never come up. Anyway, so I'm thinking to myself, I'm sitting there thinking, you know, what songs was he into, my dad? And he loved Elaine Page. Anyway, I've got a bunch of records stashed away, stuff that I've just bought from charity shops for nothing. And I go through these records and I find the Barbara Dickinson record. And I go, you what? How have I got that? First of all. Yeah. And then secondly, I think, well, I'm going to use it. What am I going to do to it or with it? How do I remember it? And that's the key. So everything on that record is my kind of way of sonically remembering what I've heard in the past, places that I've been. And it's that kind of movement between this, I suppose, a way of audio testimony, but the way that in which we move between sonic memories over time and how those degrade, how they change, and how your relationship to those sonic memories changes over time. And actually, I suppose, if you want to go back to your question of the listener, it's about having the listener experience the degradation of memory, the fragility of memory, and the fragility and the movement in perception of sound, even though you might turn around and say, you know what, I really love this song. Well, 20 years later, you might not love it. And the way that you remember it is going to be completely different to what it actually is, right? So in the process of making, going back to I Know Him So Well, what I'm thinking about is my dad's love of that song. I'm thinking about my memory of him loving it, what that means to me. And I'm also thinking about how that song can become a vehicle to my grief in some way, right? A vehicle for me to express to him through that song, through manipulation, my memory of him listening to it, right? So... And the way that I did that in that song was to play the record and manipulate it on a turntable really, really slowly. So instead of pressing play on the record, I literally turned it with my finger manually. And that then gives me the material to work with, because actually that slowness is really important. I know Jem Finer did a piece of work where he slowed a record right down, and he's got the, so a record would last for 4 hours or something. And actually there's something really interesting there about kind of pulling out all these strings of sonic material, which are there, definitely there, but you don't get hold of without kind of getting your hands on something. And I suppose that's the other part of kind of my process, is that I'm interested in materiality, and especially in materiality of records. So I've done a lot of work with that. So what would you say that is? What is materiality? Well, in terms of the record, I suppose it's the actual material of the record and the physicality of that medium, right? And what that then affords us. And I think that especially with the record, it's often seen as being very static. Here's a bit of plastic, you put it on, you can't do anything with it. Oh, you can put something into a digital sphere and you can chop it to pieces, you can reverse it, you can do all this stuff. And actually what hip-hop DJs showed us was that the record isn't static at all. It's absolutely manipulable in whatever sense, and you can play with it and make new work out of it. And experimental turntablists, Maria Chavez, Shiva Fesherecki, Yannick Schaefer, Christian Marclay, all these guys have kind of shown us that the record is extremely pliable and an interesting material, like physical material to work with. And on and on Cobblestones and Kitchari, I'm kind of playing with some of the ideas that I came up that I worked with my PhD, really, which is to take a record and chop it into pieces and literally do that. It's kind of funny. So when you talk about DJs cut up the record, man, cut it up, right? So me being kind of simple-minded to whatever degree, I went, all right, then I'll cut it up.
Yeah,
I'll literally cut it up. Or scratch it. All right, then I'll scratch it, but I'll not scratch it with a vinyl needle. I'll scratch it with a leather worker's tool and see what I get out of it. So so it's playing with the physicality of something, I think, and I think that's another thing for me is I consider myself to be quite playful and not particularly serious. Serious in many ways, but playfully serious, if that makes sense. Trying to explore things through playing with them. And I think that's really important sometimes. Because it takes you in interesting directions. That playfulness.
It's fascinating that we have reached so many similar conclusions to different pathways. I went to Ableton Loop Festival in 2015. I don't know if you know Ableton Loop, but obviously we know Ableton as a software manufacturer. But what they're so brilliant at is recognising that software is really more about community than about necessarily the mechanics of the software. So what Ableton Loop sets out to do is just bring together creatives from all over the world. And they bring educators together, they bring musicians, coders. And I can tell that they really understand the power of that. And I came away. I was very lost before I went there. Creatively. I'd really lost my mojo, lost my kind of purpose, lost it all. I'd done a lot of very high profile adverts, and that had destroyed me. Never got into doing music. To do music, but commercials. And I had this kind of Nietzschean moment of like, here lies Matt Goodison, Gordon Comstock of modern advertising. I was like, what am I doing? This is just so not what I go into music for. And I went off to Ableton Loop, which the University of Westminster sent me, and I came away, and in the centre of my page, in massive letters, I just wrote the word play. And I thought that is exactly what I've lost. I've lost the joy and the ability to recognise play as a central role in what I do. Because when you're composing adverts under extreme time pressure for huge sums of money, it's just stressful. So you're not going to get your Leatherman stab a record and record that, because you don't feel like there is time. And that was the beginning of the rebuilding for me of coming to the place I am now. I'm working with David Shepherd and getting to modular synths and tapes, remembering to play. So funny again, we've ended up in the same place. And you have a project as well called You Sound Like a Broken Record. Is that a project?
Yeah, well, that was my PhD work, basically.
That was your PhD.
You
could call it a project. A massive one.
Yeah, it was a massive one. It was a brilliant one, and that's kind of where all this stuff started. I think what happened was, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I was really into hip hop, like crazy into hip hop, and I met a guy when I was working at Blackburn College. I've always taught in FE. I met this guy. He's called Brian Nicholson. He's absolutely he's a genius dude, right? Just brilliant. Love him to bits. And we were talking about hip hop one day, and he turned me on to William Burroughs. And he was like, "Well, what these guys are doing, this cut and paste collage stuff, is Burroughs. He was doing this with literature, but he also did it with tape." And from Burroughs, from Brian talking to me about Burroughs, I ended up kind of getting on a road which sent me down the music concrete route, because obviously Schaefer was working with tape and chopping tape up and all that stuff. So, and that was the introduction, I suppose, to kind of more experimental music and playing with sound, At a similar time, I started my MA, and on my MA, I did it with a woman called Professor Tara Brabazon, and it was called Creative Media. Now, the beautiful thing about that MA was that she was really open to outcomes. So we did a lot of pedagogical work in terms of media literacy. We did a lot of work on kind of city imaging, you know, understanding the places where you are. She did 2 units on sonic media, and that introduced me to the book. I know you've seen this book, Audio Culture book, and a lot of Christoph Koch's stuff. So she introduced me to all that, and the writing and the kind of conceptual side of sound art, let's say. So thinking about sound as an artistic medium, thinking about sound as an artistic practice, I suppose as a parallel to music making, right? And that really resonated with me for coming from a radio background as well, because I think sometimes there's delineations between disciplines, and I didn't ever see that. You know, and I kind of never saw I think sound is sound, and you work with sound. Sometimes you work with it kind of in musical terms. Sometimes you work with it in interview terms, like we're doing now. Sometimes you work with it in terms of field recording or whatever. And she really, I mean, the stuff that she was giving us to think about really turned me on to that, which was really interesting, I think. And that kind of process led me to Christian Marclay and another guy called Milan Nizak. I don't know if you've ever heard of Milan Nizak. Milan Nizak was a Fluxus artist. I think he's Hungarian. I might be wrong about that, but I think he is. And he did this series called The Broken Records, and basically he was picking up records, he was burning them, he was breaking them into pieces, he was drawing all over them or whatever. And he did these kind of abstract pieces of work with broken records. So, which is all cool, really, really cool. So I started to think about my relationship with the record, and I kind of started to think about, you know, what would I do if somebody did that to one of my records?
one of your prize. You know.
So the 50 quid, I don't know, like Bob Marley first edition of Catch a Fire, if someone took that and started scrolling all over it, what would I think? And I also kind of thought about this idea, and again it kind of goes back to the same concept of sound changing over time. You know, and the memory of sound changing over time, and your relationship to these things changing over time, and how they affect your identity at a certain time, which is kind of interesting because I'm talking to you 20 years down the line, and you go, Paul, when I met you, your identity was your hip-hop DJ with all these records doing whatever you were doing. And there's a very distinct...
Scratching.
Scratching, but in a different way, right? I've never changed.
Yeah.
So there's a very distinct, I think, link between the materials that we collect, and our identity musically, the things that we are into, the way that we value those things. And I think the other question that came up for me which was quite important, was this idea that I was teaching a lot of 16-year-old kids at the time. They were all on Spotify or on YouTube. And my question was to them, how will you tell your kids what you listen to? Are you going to share a playlist with them? How are they going to find these things if YouTube doesn't exist when you're 40? Right? Where does all this stuff go that you're collecting in an online way? Do you care that you're paying for something and not actually getting anything for it, like as in the thing? And I've heard you talk about this as well, you know, getting something, unboxing it, you know, the smell of it, all that stuff, all those sensory kind of inputs that you get with a physical object have got massive impacts on the way in which you then appreciate the music that comes from those things. And and I think there's also like a real mystery in that with vinyl, you know. It's like, how is this working?
No.
And it's that going back to the kind of language of music, you know, this is a groove that's read by a needle, that when you look at it, you know that there's some sound there. It's the absolute truest representation of a sound in a material form. And there's something really interestingly mysterious about that that I just wanted to explore, really. And so it's kind of this connection between the sound, the material, the object, the person, their story, how they relate to it, but also this kind of political angle, I suppose, where the record is the unit of, or has been for a long time, the unit of sale. Yeah. How many records did you sell? You know, you go to a shop and you buy it. It's the unit of the mechanization of the industry is to sell records, right? And we've seen that kind of coming back round with Record Store Day and all that stuff, where you're charging. You know, I went in the record shop the other day and there was an ODB from the Wu-Tang 12-inch that came out on Record Store Day. It's got 3 tracks on it and it was 25 quid, you know? And you kind of go, all right, there's something happening here in terms of the way that the industry now values this stuff and how it's marketed and all that. And again, it's, you know, so this movement in terms of value, not just capital value, monetary value of objects, but how we value them, you know, and why do we keep them and how do we relate to them over time. So the project, basically, I got 14 random people through different channels, and I spoke to them about their story with that particular record. And then I took that record off them and I carved the story of them and the record back onto the surface of the record, and then I used that as material to make the songs from, to make the pieces from, and their story became the muse for the pieces that I made. So whatever it was that they particularly were talking about, the feeling that I got from sitting and talking to them was the thing that I used alongside the broken, fractured material from the records. And again, kind of go back to the beginning, it's about constraint. It's about what can I do with this awful stuff, because actually if you played it to a hip-hop DJ and you went, sample that, mate, you know, they'd be like, you what, mate? What are you talking about? That's noisy and ugly and awful and horrible, and it, you know, you shouldn't be using stuff that sounds like that. So the challenge to me then is to make that into something as beautiful as the stories that I was told, or as fractured as the stories that I was told. So yeah, that was basically where that comes from. And I think a lot of the ideas that are in that work or came from that work are still very relevant in the Cobblestones and Kitchari work. It just so happens that that work's about me, you know, my family, and the work that I did for Sound Like a Broken Record was very much about those people. And I think the other thing about that is that I always try, I mean, you never can as the artist. You're the artist. You're intervening. You know, you're making your experience, and the things that you know and the things that you do are very much a part of the work that you make. You can't separate yourself from that. But what I try and do is to give distance to that as much as I can, and that's through the process of constraint. You know, saying, okay, I'm going to try and make the most out of these things that are around me. And try and make them speak in a different way. I think it was Walter Benjamin who talks about making the apparatus work in a different register, you know. So, and that's very much a part of kind of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, great. So, and I also, listening to the records, there's parts of your dad talking, and he's talking about his patients. So your dad was a doctor.
Yeah,
Is
that's
that correct?
Right. Yeah.
And I wondered about your relationship with your dad, because obviously you didn't go down the doctor route. You've gone down a very different route. And I was wondering what your relationship with him was like, and whether part of him being a doctor encouraged you to also become a doctor. Because you've done your PhD, so you're now Dr. Paul Naturaj.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
But a very different kind of doctor.
Yeah, a very different one.
So did you have a harmonious relationship with your dad, or was it turbulent with these forces of you deciding to do a very different path?
It was never turbulent. I think he worried about me, but I think all parents worry about their kids, don't they? And because it took me I've got to say, Matt, right, it took me a long time to get going, right? And it took me a long time to kind of figure out what it was that I was trying to do and what it was that I was trying to be, and and no one really ever figures that out, particularly, do they?
No.
I think that's an ongoing thing. But the hip hop thing was about identity for me. It was really important to me in terms of being a mixed race person from Blackburn and trying to find things within the media that kind of resonated or spoke to me in some way. Because there was nothing on telly at that point. There was no real music. The only music that we kind of knew was pop music, or Bollywood music. There was kind of nothing in between. There was nothing talking to that experience, apart from hip hop. So that was kind of interesting in terms of, but I knew that I was never a hip hopper. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because I never naturally kind of could express myself through that thing. I really loved it, but I knew that there was kind of something else that I was trying to say.
That's interesting, because I saw you as the quintessential hip hopper. Someone whose whole fibre and soul resonated to the sound of hip hop. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I mean it did, but I think it's that kind of process, the creative process, I think. So there was people around us at that time who were making hip hop and who were really brilliant at it, like genuinely amazing, like made really stunningly amazing music, which has got cult following to this day, and people love it, and it's seen as being a turning point in the UK hip hop scene and all that. And those people were around us and doing that stuff, and it was amazing. And I as much as I kind of wanted to, I knew that that's not what my expression was going to be.
Right.
And so it took me a little while to find it, And I think that I was always hearing things differently to everybody else in that sense,
That's interesting.
So yeah, it took me a while to find it, and so in that way, going back to my dad, he was probably a bit worried about me, kind of going, "What is this guy up to?" You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But equally, my dad was a very, very open-minded guy.
Right.
He was very open-minded, and I suppose the way that he lived his life, he came here in 1972. In 1973, he was here for a year, and then he met my mum. He was from Preston, and they got married. And he was very open and accepting in terms of things like, I remember him saying to me very vividly, so my mum's Catholic, my dad was Hindu, practicing Hindu, and he said, well, do what you want to do. He said, if you want to go to church with your mum and see what that's like. And we had puja at home, we had prayers at home. He said his prayers every morning. So we were we did Diwali, we did the festivals, Navratri and all that stuff. So we were privy to both those things, but he never ever said to us, "You've got to be this," or "You've got to do it this way," or "You've got to do that." Right. And in a way, the Cobblestones and Kitchari record is also about that. It's also about having hip hop-esque beats, but with my cousin, singing in a front room, because that is absolutely my experience, of growing up. It's like it's an experience of both those things, and that's why it's called Kitchari. Kitchari is an Indian dish, a really, really simple Indian dish that you make from red lentils and rice, and it's like a dal dish. And we grew up on that, and it was one of my dad's favourite things, and it is cobblestone, but we walked to school on cobblestones, and we got scraps from the chippy, and we went home, and we went home and ate kitchari, and that was my experience of growing up. So it was, and my dad was so open to all of that. He was just like, well, you're here, make the most of it, but also never forget what our heritage is, and never forget who your family are, because the majority of my family are obviously Indian. He was the youngest of 12, my dad. So there's loads of us.
Wow, so you've got a huge family.
Yeah, there's loads of us. Yeah. So yeah, I like with all these things, I just. I hope that he would listen to this record and he'd be like, "What are you doing, man? This is crazy."
I joke with my dad. My dad's a really musical dad and brought me up. I was very, very lucky as a kid. My dad brought me up on a formidable collection of early blues, things like on our Hooley records. I remember answering in school the question to who landed on the moon, and I was like, finally I know the answer to this: Louis Armstrong. Which really is synonymous with my upbringing. But my dad played the most. He's got the most wonderful record collection, and in the days, like you said, before streaming, listening to music was hard, and having access to music was hard. So I was so privileged to have it. But my dad has a very simple way of judging, a very simple metric of judging music. Is it funky? Right. That's basically it. If it's funky, it's good. If it's not funky, it's not good. Which I always joke to him about. I mean, it goes a bit deeper than that, but it's funny. I was inspired by your record. So I did a record based on your record.
Yay!
Which is just awesome, and made it on a tape just like you. And I made it, I guess, inspired by your principles and practices. It was a very free, very unpolished record, probably the most unpolished record I've ever made, really, where I just did it. I did it in lockdown. It was my kind of response to coronavirus. And yeah, my dad listening to that was very interesting, because one thing it isn't is funky. So again, he was like, "Oh, son, okay. Oh, what kind of music is this?" So I can really get with that. Dad's listening to your records and drawing some interesting conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of stuff in here which is kind of interesting as well about, for me anyway, which is about Blackburn, because there's loads of field recordings from Blackburn. So he had 2 surgeries in Blackburn, my dad, one at Ewood, which is next to the football ground, and then he had another one at Larkhill, which is now disappeared. It's gone. They've knocked it down. So I kind of went round Blackburn recording these spaces as well. So quite a lot of, the fundamental kind of textures of the record have come from these field recordings. And I think there's something really interesting about field recording and memory, about going somewhere and listening to a place, listening to the emptiness of the place, and how that resonates with you in terms of kind of, and it's the overlayering of things that I find really, really interesting. And actually, Evan Eisenberg talks about when you put a record on a platter, it's like overlaying somebody else's presence in your space, in your room. It's like putting a new reality on the platter, and it being an overlaying like that. So, and I kind of feel that all the time with field recording. You go and the newness of it and the immediacy of it, I think, is really interesting. So like with one of the tracks, I recorded my uncle in Bombay telling a story about my dad, and then I took a field recording from Larkhill where his surgery was, and I overlaid the two things, because actually without this connection between them as brothers, and the connection between places, because it was my uncle Swamanath who put my dad on the plane, who paid for his ticket, who allowed him to be at Larkhill surgery in the end. And I've kind of, and I find those connections between sounds really interesting in terms of kind of really exploring a sense of place, I think, as well. Sorry, I've just become the sun over here. I've got no blinds.
Yeah, I was quite liking it. It's really, it's really abstracted. I can see.
I can't go anywhere. So anyway.
Yeah, no, it looks great. So I think to me, this, I'm kind of piecing together a story, and the latest thing I heard that you were involved with was the Kick Down the Barriers podcast, which I love. And it's a fantastic listen. So, I really encourage everyone to go and check it out. So this seems to me very unabstract. So what was the decision behind moving into that sort of space where you're more, how would you describe the podcast?
The podcast is not abstract at all. So with that work, I was commissioned to make that work by a team of curators at Blackburn Museum. And the story behind it is that there was there was two panorama programs. One that was made in 2000 and now I'll get my dates wrong, but they were 10 years apart. And essentially what happened was that they came to Blackburn and they represented Blackburn as being the most segregated town in the country, and they spoke to people who live in Whalley Range, which was the area that I was working in. Whalley Range is the oldest and most established South Asian community in Blackburn. And then you've got another place at the other side of town which is called Mill Hill, and they got a bunch of people, and Mill Hill is predominantly white, and they got a bunch of people from both of those places, and they were essentially saying, it's terribly segregated, nobody speaks to each other, this is modern Britain, God. Good old BBC, let's do a bit more fear mongering, and there's a lot of people in Blackburn watching this thing going, what are you talking about? This is not my experience. If you take Whalley Range, for example, there's they saying, people can't walk down the street in Whalley Range because they're afraid. It's like, mate, I was going to Whalley Range from when I was a kid, right, with my mum and dad, who were a mixed race couple, with two who were, interracial couple, with two mixed race kids, and we were just walking around, going into shops. Everyone loved my mum. Everyone was saying, it's like, what are you talking about? This is not the experience of the majority of people. Anyway, so the idea behind that podcast was essentially to counter some of those ideas, and it came around the time of the Black Lives Matter stuff, and I think during the Black Lives Matter movement, and still now, this is an ongoing thing. This isn't just like, we've got a month of Black Lives Matter and we've got to all think about it, but this is an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing truth that people don't listen to each other and don't take on board each other's realities and each other's stories. And my kind of approach to that was to say, all right, let's allow these people to tell us what it is about their experience. And what is your experience of growing up in Whalley Range in Blackburn? What is that actually like? What is your experience of coming to this country in 1964? What was that actually like for you? What is it that you had to go through to get here? What is it that you had to go through when you arrived? And I think a lot of the time them stories are lost. So going back to your question about abstraction, I didn't want to make anything abstract because actually I wanted those people to be able to say the things that they wanted to say. And I wanted also for people to listen to that in a very personal way. A human being to human being, this is my story, this is what I'm going to say. And actually, there's no place for abstraction there for me at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean to say that at some point I'm thinking about taking that material and doing something more poetic with it, because actually that speaks again in a different register. It talks to different people in a different way. It allows people to experience things in a new way through kind of maybe the abstraction of sound or again field recordings or montage or whatever. But actually in that first instance, for me it was the stories that were important. And the other thing about those recordings or those podcasts is that everything in them has been chosen by the people that I was working with. So the original idea before COVID was to do the interviews and then to sit down and teach people how to put these things together in workshops in the museum. And again, to just empower people to go, you know what, it doesn't have to be these big media institutions who have the control over your voice. You can do this quite simply and easily and control your own narrative. And actually, because of COVID, there was some compromise to that in terms of me having to sit at home and do it. But equally, as I'm working through these things, and actually Sound Like a Broken Record is pretty similar in terms of me going, you know what, are you all right with this? Is this okay for me to say this in this way? You know, what do you want out of it? In terms of the dialogue between us and the way that we present your story to a wider public, and in the main, you know, you Sound Like a Broken Record stuff is really abstract. But again, I think that's about words sometimes aren't enough to capture emotion.
Yeah, I can totally resonate with that. My first experience of music was growing up with my older disabled sister Sarah, and she was so profoundly disabled that she couldn't walk or talk, but she could hear, and the way to communicate with Sarah was through music. So when we played John Coltrane, Michael Jackson, Billie Jean, she really experienced that depth of emotion and joy in a way that you couldn't communicate with Sarah in any other way. So growing up with this older sister, and you're born, you know, when you're a child, you're born into a situation, you don't know what it's like to be born into another one. You've not developed empathy really yet. You just in your story, and that's it. You don't think too much about it as a kid. No. So I was born into that environment, and that just was. It just was. It wasn't sad that I had a disabled sister. That was my sister. In the same way that I always say to people with siblings, do you miss the third brother, the fourth sister that you didn't have? And they're like, are you crazy? What are you talking about? I'm like, exactly, because it just is. You don't miss children that your parents didn't have as siblings. It's insane.
Yeah. Of course.
So I was born into this environment, this situation. And it was profoundly obvious to me from the very beginning that music is the most important thing in the world, because it represents the purest form of communication. It somehow bypasses something. I don't know what. I don't know if there's any scientific evidence of this. This is just my 5-year-old brain working it out. But something in this does this, and it's profoundly important, and that's what I want to do. So I completely can understand that idea that the power of music is you can say things that words can't reach. So I'm really feeling you there with that. And
that's absolutely right. I mean, it's absolutely true. And I think what I'm also trying to do, I think, is on the side of that is to kind of start with especially with the kick down the barriers thing, is to start with the mode of communication that everybody gets. You know, because actually that's the mode of communication in that sense that is missing. You know, in terms of people just talking to each other. And all my work kind of starts with an interview, you know, talking to someone. What's it like to feel like this? What's your relationship with this record, you know, and tell me about that. And it's that kind of experience that then leads on to, I suppose, the translation of that experience into some kind of sonic material. And it doesn't matter to me particularly what that sonic material is. Does that make sense? It just has to feel right. You know, and I think I'm lucky in that respect because I don't come from a musical background, let's say, where I'm trying to make stuff to sell records or make stuff to be for my career.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I do things because they feel good. And it feels like I need to make that thing at that particular moment in time. And that's pretty much it. And I try and make it as honestly in terms of how I feel about it as I possibly can. Like in all its iterations, as I work through it, I'm just trying to be as honest to the way that I feel about it and what I think that feeling should sound like, in terms of the communication of it, and especially for the Cobblestones record, it was very much about writing, but kind of this idea of liminal spaces, merging spaces, places, objects, skewed repetition, unremembered voices, things that move and are fragile, timbres rather than actual words, like the way that things move and drift across worlds, trying to fight with this idea of presence and absence, and the way that those threads kind of come together. I'm really interested in this idea of rhizomatic movement, things like sprouting up from other things and energies coalescing in one place and then sprouting a creative idea or whatever. And Blackburn's part of that, and my experience of hip-hop's part of that, and all these records behind me are part of that, and every sound on them is part of that, and every memory is part of that. And I think, there's always fragility in the retelling, and there's always fragility in the way in which we hear, and our perception of hearing. So, and I think that connects both, both the abstract, more abstract stuff that I do, and the kick down the barriers stuff, because and you talked about this yesterday, didn't you? It's like, we love stories, we love narratives, we love telling stories, and I'm just quite lucky, I suppose, that I can play. And again, it's about playing, right? Yeah, it's about playing. I took on the kick down the barriers stuff, and I went, what do I want to do with this? Well, I've just done the Cobblestones and Kitchari record, and I've done all this, I've done no input mixing on it, and I've played with records, and I've made like 20 tape loops and had them playing at the same time, and I've done all that stuff. And then I thought, well, actually, I just want to get back down to talking to people again, so I'm going to do that.
It's like the second album, isn't it? You came out of the traps with this crazy record of no input mixing and madness, and then album 2 is like a straight up pop record where you're talking. Yeah. But no, I love it, and to me, what comes across is the generosity of your art and how committed you are to your local environment, to exploring memory and identity. And to me, your art seems so generous. It's such a giving practice, and that was interesting to take that back to the first question I asked you, where it stems from such an individual practice and such what we'd call a deep dive into your world. To me, communicates as a very generous art form in the way that it tells both your and many people's stories. So I'm going to lead you now into a very interesting space, which is really about the role of being creative and the role of being a creative in today's political system. And we're talking now against the backdrop of a conservative advert campaign suggesting that we retrain in cyber, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And I wondered about your thoughts about being a creative, about the time we grew up in and the time the next generation is growing up in, and what you really thought about creativity's role in this.
Wow, it's such a big question, Matt, isn't it? It's a really, really massive question.
Well, I find it fascinating that one of the key aspects of Britishness we celebrated in the 2012 Olympics, which is our window into what it means to be British.
Yeah.
We saw a huge window into what it means to be Chinese in their Olympic ceremony. And one of the key components of our ceremony was our creativity. NHS and creativity were the two things really showcased about Britishness. And then suddenly, 8 years later, get rid of all of that.
Yeah, but I think, Danny Boyle was was obviously the lead on that. And more than likely from his perspective, he was going, this is my chance to celebrate this stuff. So I think if it comes from some other kind of institution, then maybe that kind of way of looking at it is different, right? In terms of the government's 2012 is 2012. I think things fundamentally and profoundly changed in 2016.
Yeah.
And I think we've had there's always been a willing degradation of the arts. There's always been a movement towards STEM subjects in terms of kind of, it's the apparent value of those things. And I think that's always been there. But for the last few years, I think that's just the degradation of creative processes, creative spaces, creative people's livelihoods, and the access to creativity for kids. Over the last 10 years in the community. I mean, I'm talking about community centres and places where people can go and do interesting things. I don't know what we particularly. I think we just got to keep fighting for the spaces to do that. And I think educational establishments, whether or not they be universities or FE colleges, I don't think schools so much have got the space to do that.
Yeah.
But I've never taught in a school, so I'm kind of in a way making it up. But I do know what kids are like who come from schools, because I teach them immediately. They leave and do the GCSEs and then they come to us straight away. So I've kind of got a bit of a inkling about the way in which they approach their education and the skills. How
would you say that is? How would you say that this generation do approach their education, and what do you see coming out of schools?
I don't see a lot of critical thinking.
Yeah,
I know that much for an absolute fact. The process of critical analysis, about understanding the context of something, about asking questions about it, and working it out for yourself, and being happy to give an opinion in terms of one that's based in evidence.
And that's about voice, isn't it? That's about having a voice.
Yeah, I also think it's about saying, well, if you've looked at something on the internet, I think we're kind of straying off the creative question into a different question a little bit. But my kind of idea is that when kids look at something on the internet and they only do that in a very surface way, they then turn around and go, I've done some research. Well, what research have you done? Well, I looked it up and I found 5 links. Woo! Right? You go, did you read any of them? Where did they come from? And they can't answer that question. So this idea of researching, it kind of goes back to what we were saying the other day, investment in time and energy into something that you love. Right? And we talked about this yesterday. You wanted to be a metal fan. You had to go to the record shop. You had to find out what the records were. You had to speak to people about it. You had to take the time and the effort to invest your energy and your time into working out what it was about that thing that you loved. Right? Yeah. Going and buying magazines or whatever it might have been. Yeah. So all those paratexts, those external texts that explain that thing. Now, I'm not saying that all kids don't do that, but it would seem to me, from what I see, that very surface scratching of of your stuff is okay with them. They don't really get deep into stuff, you know. And I think there's this point of algorithm as well, you know. So the discovery of stuff by accident, I think, is a really important thing that we've lost, or that we're losing. That also kind of falls into this idea of creativity, because how to be creative with the things that are around you? Well, if you've not really got a lot of things around you, you need to be really imaginative with the things that are around you to make them interesting, you know. But if you've got access to everything, everything's kind of boring.
Yeah, I think as an educator as well, I work at the University of Westminster as a course leader for music. When we were looking at moving into an online educational space, so we now we're offering a sort of hybrid model now where we do some physical teaching and some online teaching. And doing some research into new educational thinking, I came across this amazing concept that I'd never encountered before. And it was called connectivism. So in educational theory, we are all very familiar with behaviourism. So the famous study of that was Pavlov's dogs, where they gave the dogs food, and every time they gave them food, they rang a bell. And then eventually they could just ring the bell and the dogs would salivate. So that's your typical education model of trying to manipulate people into a certain way of behaving, hence behaviourism. And then there was other educational philosophies called constructivism, which is essentially building or scaffolding knowledge. So we're moving into a better space, I think. We probably agree on that, than ringing bells or hitting kids with sticks or smacks or whatever. And the latest idea I came across, which I just adored, was called connectivism. And that's this notion that we are no longer, as educators, transmitters of knowledge, because there is just too much knowledge to have. We can't possibly contain the amount of knowledge needed. And there's so many multiple pathways coexisting that are accessible. So connectivism is a theory of essentially helping learners build on research cultures and finding their own knowledge. And as educators, we are helping learners disseminate information through critical thinking and understanding the motives and the value of that knowledge and the validity of that knowledge, and encouraging learners to become part of their world, to become sharers and participants in their cultures by starting blogs and retweeting people and following people. And I just love this idea. And it resonated so much with me being a musician. And the follow-on from that is allow, in exams and schools, allow laptops and search engines and help the kids understand information rather than basing it on some prehistoric model where people that can remember facts are clever.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think that can start early enough. And I think that's part of the problem, that actually there is probably too much emphasis on regurgitation of information. And also, like you say, kids not going, what information do I need right now for this? Rather than saying, tell me the information that I need, please. Which I think also happens. And I think, and it's been, for me also, it's been a recurring thing constantly that if kids get their information through media channels, then they should be taught media literacy from day one. I think that is a massive fundamental flaw in any education system. In the same way that you taught English or maths as a fundamental part of your, way of accessing the world, people should be media literate. They should be taught the mechanizations of the media really, really early on, because I think it will make everybody's lives better, in terms of how we access information, why we access it in that way, and making better decisions about the things that we engage with, So And I think that probably does kind of resonate with your idea of creativity. You know, I think it does probably connect in some ways with this idea of saying, well, if you understand that actually the creative process is very much at work in all of the things to a greater or lesser degree that you are engaging with, a musical creativity, you know, or a filmic creativity or a visual creativity or a fashion creativity, if you know that there's those processes of choice, of working through ideas, development of ideas, about communicating things, all that can come from a media literacy kind of syllabus. And so we'll connect to this idea that kids or people can then value the work that goes into some of the things that they engage with on a day-to-day basis, and kind of figure out that actually there's massive work there. You know,
yeah,
there's a massive amount of work there and a massive amount of thinking, which perhaps is maybe lost in the general kind of idea that these are arty-farty Mickey Mouse subjects where you swing cameras around on ropes and go and have a pint and laugh about it, you know, and you kind of which is perhaps, and I mean, again, maybe I'm generalising too much, but perhaps that's the way that people have been asked to think about some creative practices, you know.
Yeah.
And I also think that we don't engage with the complexity of the human condition enough.
Yeah.
Generally. Human beings are beautifully weird, interesting, massively complex things, creatures. And so therefore their expressions can be that. And it's valid for them to be that. And I think that the current misinformation, or at least polarisation of the political discourse, the simplicity of the political discourse, pushes us away from the understanding of human complexity. And that then pushes us away from the idea that creativity, in order to express that complexity, is important.
Yeah.
Because
yesterday we talked.
We're constantly thinking in terms of black and whites instead of nuances and greys.
Yeah.
And every shade of grey.
Yeah. And I really got that from listening to your podcast. Hearing those stories just brings to life an understanding of the human condition in a way that not hearing those stories would do. But what I was going to say was, going back to a thing we talked about yesterday as well, about, you said to me that you fell out of the hip-hop world, the hip-hop scene, when hip-hop became bling. And I don't know whether I misrepresented that.
No.
But hip-hop was a very political power. And I was never a big hip-hop fan, but I love Public Enemy and I love the soundscapes of the Bomb Squad.
Yeah.
And adore, even I would listen to that as a political act. But I too was very interested in overt political musics, but came at it more from Rage Against the Machine and UK rave music. And what I was going to ask you was, what role do you think abstract music, such as the music that both you and I make, has as a political movement, as a political statement? Why are we making these soundscapes and abstract things in such an overtly political time, do you think?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to the end of my previous answer, really, which is about, I think, homogenization is definitely very overt at the moment. The homogenization of high streets, right? the homogenization of the monopolies of communication through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the homogenization of shopping through Amazon, the homogenization of looks, right? And the homogenization of view. Left is this and right is this, and you know, it's very polarized and very simplified. And actually, I think that if you open yourself up to listening to very different forms of music or very different kind of world views or talking to people in a complex way, I think that, or reading, you know, the fact that, and I know this kind of, I learned so much through academia, I've got to say, and I know I'm not kind of part of the academic world at the moment in terms of writing papers and doing research in that formal way, but I learned so much about the way that that we can think about the world.
Me too.
And engage with it, you know, and people don't engage, or there is, again, a shift away from expertise at the moment, I would suggest. Yeah. Which I think is also important. And I think that a lot of the things that we do, if you talk to the people who make who make abstract music or experimental music or whatever, not only are they doing that, but quite a lot of them are reading and thinking and talking to one another and evolving ideas from philosophical concept. In many a lot of the people that I speak to are doing that anyway, you know.
Yeah,
there's an underlying knowledge base in philosophy which then leads to the expression of those philosophical ideas through kind of sonic creation. And in terms of that, I think that philosophical thought has to be political, because it tries to understand the whys and wherefores about why we do what we do and why the systems in which we live exist in the way that they exist. So if that's the base point for you to translate that into some kind of creation, then it's definitely a political act.
Yeah. Yeah,
does that make sense, or was that like...
No, absolutely. And your work is very much about identity, story and belonging. And I agree with you, like when you said that understanding someone's story can take... Well, going back to the why you're doing your podcast, you saw a representation of Blackburn on the BBC that didn't resonate with your experience being from Blackburn and your upbringing. So then you used art to communicate a different story. And this really resonates into the polarization of the internet as a new form, because the beginning of the internet felt like it offered so much. It gave us the means of distribution to everyone.
Yeah.
So you could never have asked for more power. But interestingly, what's happened, and this is really shown in the long tail theory. I don't know if you've come across the long tail. Yeah, it's very, very famous from the dude who did The Wire. Is it someone Kelly? And the long tail, for those that don't know it, allows for much more access to art forms and ideas that would have died in a more funneled system. So, for example, your record and my record would not probably have graced the cassette shelves of HMV.
Definitely not, man.
But yet, they are findable and buyable online. But what's so interesting about the long tail is, while it's given rise to more, what seems to have happened is that blockbusters and the Ed Sheerans and the Taylor Swifts have just got bigger. So rather than creating a culture of more diversity, it's created, as you said, a more homogenized culture because hits sort of seem to have never been bigger.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I don't. In a way, I don't think that's surprising when the internet is basically fueled by advertising revenue. So it's exactly the same as having. Do you want your advert on during Coronation Street? Yeah, well, it's going to cost you 70 grand. Okay, so if it's going to cost you 70 grand, then the person who's making, I don't know, who's got the independent bakery down the road can't advertise, right? But Hovis can. There you go, because they can afford it. So, but if the model of getting your stuff out there on the internet to the majority of people is based on that principle of paying for advertising, then the big boys are always going to win.
And who are the big boys now?
Well,
that's Facebook, Google, Apple.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I mean, but still, and this is the positive and the hope that which you kind of always hold on to is the fact that the internet has allowed us to reconnect.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Right? In this way, in a really meaningful way, interestingly meaningful, positive way, and it's also given rise to the idea. I mean, let's take the Cobblestones and Kitchari record, right? I when I'd finished it, I had no idea what to do with it. I'd done this stuff. I didn't know what to do with it. I was like, what am I going to do? Do I put it out? Anyway, I sent it to a few people who are friends of mine. And one of the people that I sent it to was Graham Dunning, who runs Fractal Meat. And then he went, yeah, I'll put it out. And I was like, mate, mind blown. Seriously?
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's so cool, right? And actually, without the internet, that would never have happened. I would never have met him in the first place, right? And that whole process would never have happened. So I think, yes, it's been compromised by capital in terms of its the ideals that it was set out to achieve as a sharing of information, free, an egalitarian space for everybody to work. I mean, that's obviously been compromised by capital. There's no doubt about that. However, there are spaces there which allow people to make and create and be and to speak kind of in a true or untrue way. But yeah, I mean, with anything, isn't it? It's about balance, man. I think there's lots of great things, and on a personal level, there's lots of great things. But I also, I hate the internet too because it does my head in.
Yeah, never a truer word said. Yeah, we touched on that yesterday, didn't we? How capitalism seems to be this ever-growing Pac-Man that consumes everything and regurgitates it as another product to buy into.
Yeah,
whether it's any kind of form. And the internet, again, we were talking yesterday that to even belong to these communities of practice, I can't imagine not being able to do it with the internet, not having to be part of that system. And that's why I called this podcast Play in the System, because of that essential, how big is that space in the system for play? And is it possible to play out the system? Is it possible to not be part of this dangerous social media environment?
Yeah, I think you touched,
but still connect.
I don't think it is these days, and that's is scary.
Yeah, that is really scary, isn't it?
That actually it's 100% necessary to use a system which I personally have massive problems with in many instances, but you can't. But to separate yourself from it is to maybe separate yourself from opportunity.
Yeah.
And again, what was that? What else was I going to do with that record? You know, like it's, you know, taking it back to a personal thing. What would it have done? Sat on my hard drive forever.
Yeah.
And then what? I mean, great, that's fine. But it's nice it's nice that it's gone somewhere and there's an opportunity there, you know, which I wouldn't have got if I wasn't in that space in some way. But I suppose then it's about choosing your spaces. I think the scary thing for me is, you know, that I don't know, there's probably something that exists. I don't know if you know that if there is, but is there another social media kind of gathering site which is outside of Facebook, which has got more of an ethical kind of way of being than Facebook does, that isn't quite so questionable? I don't know. If there isn't, then I'm sure that there must be, man. But again, it's like why do we not know about it? You know?
Yeah. Maybe this is the space that will open up. Now we're starting to recognise the ethics of social media.
Yeah, and I think things are going to change. In the same way we
recognise the ethics of banking. And
I mean, things are going to change as well, aren't they? Because people can't get together in the pub anymore.
Yeah.
Or aren't going to be able to for the foreseeable future, or for however long it might be. So, you know, I think the platforms are going to have to maybe change, or I don't know. I'd love. There probably is, and it's something for me to look for. But I'd love a space outside of Facebook for people to chat. I'd love an Instagram that wasn't driven by
owned by Facebook.
Or, you know. I mean, Instagram was great. I mean, wasn't it brilliant when it started? Instagram?
It was great. Yeah.
It was just brilliant. You know, no adverts, and basically, if I followed you, I'd see every picture that you took, and it was really brilliant. You know, and it did feel like a real community. Now it just feels like I'm entering into an advertiser's dream to kind of make sure that I know what's going on with, I don't know, my brother or whatever. It's so weird, man.
But that's capitalism, isn't it? And that's we talked about this yesterday as well, the neoliberal agenda that we're part of. Let's just imagine we started Instagram and we ran it for 10 years and it was this space, and then it was very popular, and then someone came along and said, hey, Paul, hey, Matt, I want to buy this. And they're offering, I mean, what would Facebook have paid for it? I mean, the sums are so large, I can't even guess.
Was it not like 1.2 billion or something?
What would you do?
Man, you know what I'd do.
We'd sell, right? We'd take the 1.2 billion and probably think, great, we can bring back community spaces for art. And
I would. And I'd buy some equipment.
Then your music wouldn't be very good anymore. You'd make a glossy third album.
I'd actually get something that works. That's what I'd do. Yeah.
It would ruin the vibe, or it would ruin the vibe of your music. But I did think, and it's a good question. So I am a millionaire. What would I do? And I realised that I'm very fortunate that my life would be not that different, other than I'd be working for my own education business, teaching people.
Yeah.
And I'd have some time ring-fenced to my own art. And actually my day-to-day life would be very similar, probably more stressful, because I'd then be the owner of the whole thing.
Yeah.
But I felt very fortunate to come to that realisation. And I do wonder, this is a perennial question as an educator, is what is the difference that we experience going to education without paying fees versus graduating now with such high levels of debt? What does that do to the soul? What does that do to what we both recognise, the value of play? And bringing that to my experience of being an advert media composer, under that pressure, play felt very much like something that should be thrown off the ship. Wasteful, commercially wasteful, but we realise that it's commercially valuable. So, many fears and thoughts there. But like you, I remain optimistic, and there are many great things that have come out of the internet, and hopefully even this political time we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, the world has been through awful times, hasn't it? Really terrible, tragic, awful times. And, you know, it's a wave, man. It's a wave.
Yeah.
It's a wave.
I love that.
It'll yeah, exactly, your wavescape stuff. It will. And at some point, it'll reach its peak and it'll crash. And then something else needs to happen. And I think what we need to be kind of aware of, or what I need to be aware of, or what I'm trying to think about being aware of, is at the point when that crash happens and the void exists, to do something really positive with that, and to make sure that we use it. We use the knowledge of this negativity, this constant negativity that we're in. To kind of flip that and do something really positive with it, and to try and bring people together, or to change the way we think about one another. And I think that's fundamentally it. You know, since 2016, for me, it's about we've been asked. Some people have gone down the road, but we've been asked to think about people in a negative way. We've been asked to blame each other for things. We've been asked to point the finger and to scapegoat people on all different sides. I'm not talking about any side here. I'm talking about on all different sides, just as a general way of being in the world. That's what we've been kind of asked to do. And I think if that crashes, at what point that crashes, we need to look at that really seriously and go, actually, let's think about each other differently again. Let's think about each other as brothers and sisters, rather than as people who make my life difficult, right? Which it seems to me that's the pervading kind of feeling of since 2016. That's kind of what I get anyway.
That's a great end game point. I love it. Lovely place to end. Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time
honestly,
to
man,
come on.
Thank you so much for asking me to do it. You know, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thanks so much for having me on and spending the time to chat. Like, top stuff, really brilliant. Thank you so much. It's
been incredible to reconnect after 20 years.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, you have a lovely day.
I'm
looking forward to the next record.
Yeah, there's something in the pipeline. There's definitely something in the pipeline, yeah. In fact, I'm doing something with an ex-student of mine who's... can I swear on here? Is that all right?
Yeah, you can swear.
All right. So Danny, who's an ex-student of mine from Blackburn, he was in a band called Crywank, who were amazing. They've disbanded.
You can't not be amazing with that name.
Yeah, they're totally brilliant. I honestly recommend people to go and check them out if they can. Brilliant. And the guy that I initially was talking about, who kind of turned me on to the William Burroughs stuff, Brian Nicholson. So we've got our heads together and we're trying to do something which is basically about nonsense. So this whole conversation, actually, not that it's nonsense, no, but no, this kind of whole idea at the moment about misinformation, about spreading disinformation, about nonsense, people just talking lies, you know, just basically blatantly lying and going, no, I'm not lying. You're like, well, you're lying. Yesterday you said that, and now you say, no, I'm not. You know, that whole kind of nonsense thing that we're in. It's nonsense, right? So we're doing something which plays with that idea by, guess what, chopping up records, right? So that's hopefully on its way. We're just trying to put that together at the moment. Like, Brian writes these amazing kind of nonsense reviews of albums that don't exist. So we're making them. That's great. That's essentially what we're doing. So again, like, very playful, you know, very playful. So, yeah.
Love it. Well, thank you again. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. It's been brilliant hanging out with you this morning.
Yeah, cool, man. My pleasure. All the very best.
And one day I hope to see you again.
Who knows?
In the flesh, but who knows? Let's not hang around for that.
Yeah. All right,
See you, Paul. Have a great day.